The smart thing would have been to turn around, walk back into the house, and call Sheriff Morrison. That's what any rational person would do when confronted with something that shouldn't exist. But Maggie had stopped being rational the moment those amber eyes met hers across the moonlit pasture, and she recognized something achingly familiar in their depths. She followed. Her bare feet found the worn cattle path through instinct more than sight. The same route she'd walked 1,000 times during her evening rounds. The creature moved with surprising grace for something so massive, its silver-tipped fur catching moonbeams like scattered coins. It never looked back again, but somehow Maggie knew it was aware of her every step, every ragged breath, every moment of doubt that whispered she should flee. The night air clung to her skin like wet wool, thick with the promise of a storm that wouldn't come. August in the Ozarks had turned cruel this year. 97 degrees even after sunset, the kind of heat that baked moisture from everything it touched. Her cattle had taken to standing belly deep in the pond during the day, and even the mockingbirds had given up their evening concerts. Only the mosquitoes seemed to thrive, rising from the stagnant creek beds in biblical clouds. The creature paused at the edge of Bitter Creek, or what used to be Bitter Creek before the drought reduced it to a chain of muddy puddles. Maggie caught her first clear look at it in the open moonlight, and her veterinarian's mind catalogued details with clinical precision, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. 7 feet tall, easily. Bipedal, with the elongated snout and pointed ears of a wolf, but shoulders that belonged on a linebacker. Its hands, she couldn't think of them as paws, not with those articulated fingers, hung at its sides with unsettling humanity. When it turned its head to scan the tree line, she caught the profile that would haunt her dreams. Intelligent, calculating, predatory, but somehow sad. "What are you?" she whispered. The creature's ears swiveled toward her voice, but it didn't respond. Instead, it stepped across the dried creek bed and continued toward the limestone bluffs that marked the eastern boundary of her property. Maggie had owned this land for 23 years, first as David's wife and now as his widow, but she'd never explored the caves that honeycombed the bluffs. David had always warned her away from them. Unstable, he'd said, dangerous, but David had said a lot of things that were turning out to be lies. The discovery of his secret bank account had been the first crack in the foundation of their marriage, even posthumously. $47,000 she'd known nothing about, funded by deposits from something called Helix Research Solutions. When she'd tried to contact the company, she'd found nothing. No website, no phone listing, no business registration in Arkansas or anywhere else. Just monthly payments of $3,000 stretching back 6 years before his disappearance. Money he'd never mentioned during all those nights when they'd sat at the kitchen table, worrying over feed costs and veterinary bills for cattle that barely turned a profit. The creature stopped at the base of a limestone outcropping, draped in kudzu and wild grapevines. To Maggie's eyes, it looked like solid rock, but the creature pushed through the vegetation and simply vanished. She stood alone in the humid darkness, wondering if heat stroke could cause hallucinations this vivid. Then she heard it, a sound she'd hoped never to hear again. Her name, called in David's voice, echoing from somewhere deep in the stone. Maggie. The rational part of her mind insisted it was wind through the cave system, or maybe her own guilt finally manifesting as auditory hallucinations. 3 years of second-guessing every argument, every harsh word, every moment she could have been kinder to a man who'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep their ranch afloat. 3 years of wishing she'd paid more attention to where he went during those long absences he'd explained away as checking the back pastures. But this voice carried the exact cadence of David calling her name on summer evenings when supper was ready, the same slight Arkansas drawl that had first charmed her when they'd met at veterinary school 35 years ago. Maggie pushed through the curtain of vegetation and found herself staring into a cave mouth easily tall enough for the creature to enter upright. Cool air drifted from the opening, carrying scents of limestone and something else. Something organic and wrong that made her veterinarian's training scream warnings about decomposition and death. The smart thing would have been to turn around. Instead, she pulled out her phone, activated its flashlight, and stepped into the darkness where monsters waited to show her truths that decent people were never meant to know. Behind her, the night held its breath. Maggie's phone light carved a pale circle through the cave's throat, illuminating limestone walls that wept with condensation. Each step echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, and she found herself walking on tiptoe despite knowing the creature already knew exactly where she was. The temperature dropped with each yard deeper, a blessed relief from the suffocating heat above, though the coolness carried that persistent odor of decay that made her stomach clench. The tunnel curved to the right, then split into 3 passages. Maggie hesitated, sweeping her light across each opening, when she heard it again. "Maggie!" The voice seemed to drift from the middle passage, David's tone carrying that same patient fondness he'd used when calling her in from the garden for dinner. She followed the sound deeper into the earth, her bare feet finding purchase on stone worn smooth by underground water that had long since dried up. The drought's reach extended even here, into places that should have been eternal springs. Everything was dying this summer, her pastures, her cattle, the hope she'd been nursing that she could somehow keep the ranch running on her veterinarian's pension, and the life insurance money that was dwindling faster than she cared to calculate. The passage opened into a chamber large enough that her phone's light couldn't find the far walls. Cool air moved across her skin like fingers, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, she could hear the creature breathing. Slow, measured, waiting, but she could also hear something else, a low humming, electrical and wrong, as if machinery was running somewhere deep below. "David!" she called, her voice cracking on his name. The humming stopped. The creature's breathing stopped. Even the constant drip of condensation seemed to pause, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. Then footsteps, not the creature's heavy gait, but the familiar rhythm of David's work boots on flagstone, the same sound he'd made coming up from the cellar every evening when she'd called him for supper. Maggie's rational mind knew it was impossible. David had been dead 3 years, his body never found despite weeks of searching these very hills. Sheriff Morrison had finally declared him deceased after his abandoned truck was discovered at the bottom of Miller's Gorge, though they'd never located a body. The insurance company had balked, but eventually paid out, citing the impossibility of survival in that terrain. But rational thought had abandoned her the moment she'd seen those amber eyes across her pasture. Some deeper part of her, the part that had spent 30 years healing wounded animals and recognizing when something was fundamentally wrong, knew that everything she'd believed about her husband's death was a carefully constructed lie. The footsteps grew closer, and with them came a smell she remembered from her early days. As a veterinarian, formaldehyde, antiseptic, the chemical cocktail used to preserve specimens. It was a smell that had no business in a natural cave system, yet it grew stronger with each approaching step. "I waited for you," David's voice said from the darkness ahead. "Knew you'd come eventually. You never could leave well enough alone." That was true. It was the same stubbornness that had driven her to check that secret bank account, to make phone calls to government offices that claimed no knowledge of Helix research solutions, to spend sleepless nights poring over David's papers looking for answers that seemed to slip away like smoke. The same inability to accept simple explanations that had made her a good veterinarian and, apparently, a poor wife. "Where are you?" she whispered, though part of her didn't want an answer. Her phone light swept across the chamber walls, revealing scratches in the limestone, some natural, carved by millennia of water flow, but others disturbingly regular. Marks that looked almost like writing, or symbols, etched deep into the rock by something with claws, or tools. The distinction was becoming increasingly unclear. "I'm right where you left me, Maggie. Right where I've always been." The voice was directly ahead now, perhaps 20 feet away. Her light couldn't penetrate that far into the chamber's depths, but she could sense movement in the darkness, shapes that shouldn't exist, sounds that belonged to no animal she'd ever treated. The creature was still there, too, a massive presence at the edge of her perception, watching, waiting. Maggie took another step forward, then another. Her phone's battery was at 60%, Enough light for maybe an hour if she was careful. But careful had never been her strong suit, not when patients needed her, not when David had needed her during those final months when he'd grown distant and secretive and somehow fundamentally changed. She'd failed him then, too distracted by the ranch's financial troubles to notice how thin he'd become, how his eyes had developed that same hunted look she'd seen in animals that had been kept in captivity too long, too trusting when he'd explained away his absences, too willing to believe his stories about checking fence lines that never seemed to need repair. The darkness ahead stirred, and Maggie stepped forward to meet whatever truth was waiting for her in the depths of her own land. Her phone light finally found them. The first thing Maggie saw was David's wedding ring, still gleaming gold on skeletal fingers that clutched a manila folder to what remained of his chest. He sat propped against the far wall of the chamber, his body naturally mummified by the cave's dry air and constant temperature. His clothes, the same blue work shirt and jeans he'd worn the morning he disappeared, hung loose on bones that told the story of months of slow starvation. But it was his skull that made Maggie's breath catch. 2 neat holes, perfectly round, drilled through the temporal bones with surgical precision. Hardware ports, she realized with the clinical detachment that had carried her through 30 years of difficult diagnoses. Someone had installed computer interfaces directly into her husband's brain. "Jesus, David," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. The folder crumbled at her touch, but the photographs inside were preserved in plastic sleeves. Image after image of creatures that shouldn't exist, wolves walking upright, their spines elongated and their skulls distorted by rapid bone growth. Men and women strapped to gurneys, their faces slack with sedation, while technicians in hazmat suits prepared syringes filled with something that glowed faintly green. Test subjects in holding cells, their transformations photographed in clinical detail. Day 1, subject shows increased aggression. Day 15, bone density increased 300%, muscle mass doubled. Day 30, cognitive function deteriorating, but physical capabilities beyond human norms. The final photograph showed David himself, unconscious on a medical table while a surgeon positioned a drill against his skull. The date stamp read 3 days before his disappearance. Behind her, the creature's breathing had grown labored, almost pained. Maggie turned to find it crouched in the tunnel entrance, its massive frame blocking her only exit. But its amber eyes weren't threatening. They were desperate, pleading, and devastatingly familiar. She'd seen those exact eyes staring back at her from the bathroom mirror every morning for 23 years of marriage. "David?" The word came out as barely more than a breath. The creature, David, nodded once, a heartbreakingly human gesture that sent ice through her veins despite the chamber's warmth. When he opened his mouth, the voice that emerged was distorted by his altered vocal cords, but unmistakably his. They promised cure for the cancer. Maggie's mind reeled. David had never mentioned cancer, never shown symptoms, never. But then she remembered those final months, how he'd grown thin and secretive, how he'd started wearing long sleeves even in the heat, how he'd flinched when she'd tried to examine a persistent cough he'd dismissed as allergies. "The money," she said. "Helix research. You were a test subject." David's massive head bobbed in what might have been a nod. "Experimental, treatment, gene therapy, military, applications." Each word seemed to cause him pain, forced through a larynx not designed for human speech. They said, temporary, said they could reverse it. More photographs scattered from the deteriorating folder. Government seals on documents marked classified. Correspondence between Helix Research and something called the Enhanced Soldier Initiative. Financial records showing payments to dozens of test subjects across 3 states. Payments that had stopped abruptly 18 months ago when the program was apparently shut down. But the subjects hadn't been cured. They'd been abandoned. "You came back," Maggie said, understanding flooding through her. "After the transformation completed, you came home. Couldn't let you live with the lie." David's altered features twisted with emotion. "Knew you'd blame yourself for not seeing the signs. The terrible irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years drowning in guilt over missing her husband's suffering, only to discover he'd hidden a terminal diagnosis and volunteered for experimental treatment to spare her the agony of watching him die slowly. His last act of love had been to disappear rather than burden her with the truth of what he was becoming. "The others," she said, remembering the multiple subjects in the photographs. "There are others like you." David's growl confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. The drought hadn't just killed her cattle and dried up the creeks. It had forced creatures that should have remained hidden to venture closer to human settlements in search of water. The sightings Sheriff Morrison had been dismissing as heat-induced hallucinations, the missing livestock from neighboring properties, the game cameras that captured impossible shapes moving through the darkness. Maggie looked at the evidence scattered around her husband's preserved corpse, documentation of illegal human experimentation, government cover-ups and corporate malfeasance that reached into the highest levels of military research. Then she looked at David, trapped in a form that was neither human nor animal, asking nothing except that she know the truth. The choice crystallized in her mind with brutal clarity. She could take this evidence to the authorities, expose the conspiracy, demand justice for the victims of Helix Research's experiments. Or she could protect the creatures like David who had survived, who deserved better than to become specimens in another government laboratory. She couldn't do both. "What do you need from me?" she asked. David's transformed features shifted in what might have been surprise. In the pale glow of her phone light, Maggie could see him struggling to process her question, as if he'd expected anything except her willingness to help. His amber eyes, so familiar yet so alien, searched her face for several long heartbeats before he managed to speak. "Safe passage," he finally rasped. "Others are hungry, desperate. Drought driving them closer to towns." The weight of what he was asking settled over Maggie like a physical thing. She thought of the missing livestock reports Sheriff Morrison had mentioned, the blurry game camera footage that showed impossible shapes stalking through the darkness. How long before one of these creatures encountered a family camping in the national forest? How long before desperation overrode whatever remained of their human restraint? "You want me to help you relocate them?" It wasn't a question. Find somewhere they can hide until what? Until when, David? This isn't something that gets better with time. David's massive shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked utterly defeated. "Don't know. Just know. They deserve better than cages again." Maggie's phone buzzed with a low battery warning, and she realized with growing panic that she was sitting in an underground chamber with her husband's mummified corpse, while his transformed body blocked her only exit. The rational part of her mind, the part that had guided her through 3 decades of veterinary practice, screamed that she was in mortal danger. David might retain fragments of his human consciousness, but the photographs scattered around his remains told a different story. Day 30, cognitive function deteriorating. What guarantee did she have that recognition was enough to override predatory instincts? "The evidence," she said, buying time while her mind raced through possibilities. "David, this could bring down everyone involved. Helix Research, the military contractors, the government officials who authorized human experimentation. These people destroyed lives, including yours. They need to face consequences. And then what?" David's distorted voice carried a bitterness that made her flinch. "You think they'll prosecute? Cover-up goes too deep, Maggie. Too many important people involved." He was right, and she knew it. She'd spent enough years dealing with government veterinarians and agricultural inspectors to understand how quickly bureaucracies could close ranks when their interests were threatened. The evidence might generate headlines for a week, maybe congressional hearings that would ultimately blame mid-level administrators who'd already been reassigned to other departments. Meanwhile, David and the other survivors would become the most hunted creatures on Earth. "There has to be another way," she insisted. But even as she spoke the words, she could feel her conviction wavering. Her phone battery was down to 40% now, and she was acutely aware of the tons of limestone hanging over her head, the narrow tunnel that represented her only route to the surface. David could kill her without effort, accidentally if nothing else. His transformed hands could crush her skull like an eggshell. But it was her bank balance, not her physical safety, that made her hesitate. The ranch was already bleeding money faster than her pension could sustain. Feed costs, equipment repairs, property taxes that climbed every year while cattle prices remained stagnant. She'd been telling herself she could make it work for another year, maybe 2 if beef prices recovered. But deep down she'd known the truth. Without David's income, she was slowly going broke. Helping relocated cryptid creatures would require resources she didn't have. Fuel for long-distance transport, medical supplies for injuries, food for creatures whose dietary requirements she could only guess at, and all of it would have to be done in absolute secrecy, because even a whisper of her involvement would bring federal attention that would end with both her and David in underground laboratories. "I can't afford this," she said quietly, hating herself for the admission. "David, I'm barely keeping the ranch. The life insurance money is almost gone, and the cattle aren't generating enough income to cover expenses. If I help you, if I get caught, she would lose everything." The ranch David had worked himself to death trying to preserve, the life they'd built together, her veterinary license, her pension, her freedom, all of it would disappear into the same black hole that had swallowed Helix Research's inconvenient test subjects. David's breathing had grown heavier, more labored, and Maggie realized with growing alarm that emotion was affecting his self-control. His massive hands were clenched into fists, claws digging furrows in his palms. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones of something that definitely wasn't human. Always about the money, wasn't it, Maggie? Even when I was dying. The accusation hit like a physical blow, partly because it carried enough truth to hurt. How many evenings had they spent arguing about finances instead of talking about what was really wrong? How many times had she been too stressed about bills to notice her husband's growing desperation? Her phone screen dimmed to preserve battery, plunging the chamber into deeper darkness where predator eyes gleamed with inhuman intelligence. In the near darkness, Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, but a recognition that ran deeper than rational thought. Those amber eyes weren't just familiar because they belonged to David. They carried the same desperate exhaustion she'd seen in her own reflection every morning since the insurance money started running out, the same trapped helplessness of creatures backed into corners with no good choices remaining. "You're right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I failed you when you were dying, and I'm failing you now." David's massive form went still, his labored breathing the only sound in the chamber. "But I'm done failing." The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious decision, from the same place that had driven her to follow impossible tracks across her drought-scorched pasture. "The money doesn't matter. The ranch doesn't matter. What matters is that they turned my husband into a weapon and threw him away when the experiment went wrong." She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the protest from knees that had spent too many years kneeling beside sick cattle. Her phone's dim light caught the edge of a photograph. One of the creatures in a holding cell, its human eyes staring out from a wolf's face with an expression of such profound loss that it made her chest tighten. "How many others are there?" David's response came as a low rumble that might have been relief. 7. Still alive. 3 disappeared after the shutdown. Maggie did the math quickly. 7 creatures. Possibly more, scattered across the Ozark wilderness with winter only 4 months away. The drought would break eventually, it always did, but these things couldn't return to civilization. They'd need territory, food sources, medical care for injuries their altered bodies might sustain. They'd need someone who understood animal behavior and had experience treating species that didn't exist in any veterinary textbook. They'd need her. "The equipment," she said, gesturing toward the photographs. Helix Research didn't just abandon the subjects. They left infrastructure behind. David's nod was barely visible in the fading light. "Laboratory, 40 miles north. Hidden in abandoned mining operation. Still has medical equipment. Supplies." Of course it did. Companies like Helix didn't waste valuable assets. They mothballed them, waiting for political climates to shift or new contracts to emerge. Somewhere in those mountains was a fully equipped research facility that probably contained enough resources to help the survivors, if she could figure out how to access it without triggering security systems that would bring federal agents swarming over the hills. The other ranchers, she said, pieces falling into place. Morrison mentioned missing livestock. That's not random predation. You've been coordinating with the others, trying to keep them fed without attracting attention. David's silence confirmed her suspicion. The pattern made sense now. Carefully selected cattle from properties whose owners would blame coyotes or bears, kills that were clean and efficient, with meat taken but carcasses left behind to support the cover story. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking David had always excelled at, the same methodical planning that had kept their ranch profitable through 2 recessions and a drought. Her husband might be physically transformed, but his mind, what remained of it, was still sharp enough to organize a survival network for creatures that shouldn't exist. "Show me," she said. The words hung in the stale air between them, carrying weight that both of them understood. This wasn't just about helping David anymore. This was about stepping across a line that separated her old life, the safe, predictable existence of a struggling rancher, from something that would transform her as surely as Helix research had transformed their test subjects. David rose slowly to his full height, his massive frame filling the tunnel entrance. In the dying light of her phone, his features seemed to shift between human and animal, familiar and alien. When he spoke, his voice carried something she hadn't heard since before his disappearance. Hope. No going back, he warned. Once you see, the others know their stories. You'll be part of this. Maggie thought of her checking account balance, her mounting bills, the ranch that would probably be foreclosed within a year regardless of what choice she made tonight. Then she thought of David volunteering for experimental treatment because he'd been too proud to burden her with his diagnosis, and of creatures that had once been human struggling to survive in forms that belonged to nightmares. "I've been part of this since you disappeared," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." David stepped aside, and Maggie moved toward the tunnel that would lead them both away from the safety of ignorance and into whatever waited in the darkness above. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, or maybe time moved differently when you were following your transformed husband toward creatures that shouldn't exist. Maggie's phone battery had dropped to 30%, and she found herself counting steps to distract from the weight of limestone pressing down above them. David moved with surprising grace for something his size, his claws clicking softly against the rock as he navigated turns that would have left her disoriented in complete darkness. When they finally emerged into the pre-dawn air, Maggie was startled to discover how long they'd been underground. The eastern sky showed the first pale hints of morning, and the August heat that had been suffocating at midnight now felt almost cool against her skin. David paused at the cave entrance, his massive head turning to scan the surrounding forest with senses that were no longer entirely human. "They'll smell you," he said, his distorted voice barely audible. "Your scent is unfamiliar, might trigger defensive responses." The casual way he mentioned this made Maggie's stomach clench. She was about to meet creatures whose human consciousness was deteriorating, whose predatory instincts were, apparently, strong enough to require warnings about defensive responses. The veterinarian in her understood the dynamics. Cornered animals were the most dangerous, and these particular animals had been systematically betrayed by every human they'd trusted. "What do I need to know?" she asked. "About the rules of this?" David's amber eyes reflected the growing dawn light as he considered her question. "Never move fast, never turn your back, never show fear. They can smell it, and it triggers hunting instincts." He paused, his features twisting with what might have been pain. Some days are better than others. Cognitive function fluctuates with stress, hunger, territorial disputes. The phrase sent ice through her veins as she realized what it meant. These weren't just struggling survivors. They were apex predators forced into proximity by circumstances, each one capable of tearing apart anything that threatened their tenuous existence. They moved through the forest in single file, David's massive frame creating a path that Maggie followed with growing unease. The drought had left the understory brittle and brown, and every step seemed to announce their presence with sounds that would carry for miles in the still air. But David appeared unconcerned, occasionally stopping to examine scent markers that were invisible to human senses. 20 minutes into their trek, he raised one clawed hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a military signal for halt. Maggie froze, her heart hammering as she strained to hear whatever had triggered his warning. The forest around them was eerily quiet. No bird songs, no insect chorus, nothing but the whisper of wind through dying leaves. Then she saw the eyes. They gleamed from the shadows between two massive oak trees, pale yellow and utterly alien. As her vision adjusted, more appeared, at least 4 sets, positioned at heights that suggested creatures nearly as large as David. She caught glimpses of dark fur, of shapes that moved with liquid grace between the trees, of intelligence that was definitely not animal, but no longer quite human either. "Sarah," David called softly, his voice carrying an odd mixture of authority and gentleness. "Maggie needs to see." One of the creatures stepped forward into a shaft of early sunlight, and Maggie had to bite back a gasp. She'd seen the photographs, but confronting the reality was something else entirely. The thing that had once been Sarah retained enough human characteristics to be heartbreaking: familiar proportions in the torso, hands that were elongated but recognizably hands, facial features that suggested a woman in her 30s. But everything else screamed predator: muscles that corded beneath dark fur, teeth designed for tearing flesh, claws that could disembowel prey with casual efficiency. "Margaret Sinclair," the creature said, her voice a guttural approximation of human speech. "David told us. You might help." The hope in those words was devastating. Here was a woman who'd volunteered for experimental treatment, probably for the same reasons as David, some terminal diagnosis that made any alternative seem preferable to certain death, and been abandoned when the transformation exceeded all parameters. Now she was asking for help from the wife of a fellow test subject, clinging to the possibility that someone might see them as more than monsters. "I'll try," Maggie said, though she had no idea how to keep such a promise. The other creatures emerged from concealment one by one, and Maggie found herself facing what remained of Helix Research's Enhanced Soldier Initiative, 2 men and 1 woman, their transformations slightly different but uniformly devastating. One retained more human facial features, but had developed bone spurs that protruded from his shoulders and forearms like organic armor. Another moved on limbs that had lengthened grotesquely, giving him an arachnid gait that made her skin crawl. The third was the most disturbing because she was the most human, a young woman whose transformation seemed limited to enhanced musculature and predatory senses, until she spoke and revealed teeth that belonged in a shark's mouth. "We remember being human," she said, her words carefully enunciated around dental modifications that made speech difficult, some days more than others. "But we remember enough to know. This isn't living." The weight of that statement settled over the clearing like a shroud. Maggie found herself studying each transformed face, searching for traces of the people they'd once been: parents, siblings, children who'd trusted government promises and paid the ultimate price. The young woman with shark teeth couldn't be more than 25. She should have been planning a career, maybe a family. Instead, she was trapped in a body that would never allow her to touch another human being without risking their life. "What are your names?" Maggie asked, the veterinarian in her recognizing the importance of individual identity in maintaining cognitive function. The one with bone spurs stepped forward, his movement careful and deliberate. "Marcus Chen, former Marine Corps, diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer." His voice carried the clipped precision of military training, though the words emerged as growls. They promised enhanced healing, accelerated recovery. Said I'd be stronger than ever. The woman with shark teeth managed something that might have been a bitter laugh. "Jessica Torres, 24 years old, cystic fibrosis." She gestured to her altered form with hands that ended in razor-sharp claws. They weren't entirely wrong about the enhanced part. The one with elongated limbs remained silent, though Maggie could see intelligence burning in his pale eyes. David moved closer to him, a gesture that spoke of protective instincts that transcended their shared monstrosity. "Thomas," David said quietly. He was closest to breakthrough when shutdown happened. Sometimes doesn't speak for days. The implications hit Maggie like a physical blow. Whatever process had transformed them was still active, still changing their brain chemistry. The photographs in the cave had documented cognitive deterioration, but seeing it firsthand was different. These people were losing themselves piece by piece, their human consciousness eroding while their bodies became increasingly suited for violence. "The facility you mentioned," she said to David. "What kind of medical equipment are we talking about?" "Everything," Sarah replied before David could answer. "MRI scanners, blood work laboratories, surgical suites. They were monitoring us constantly, trying to understand the transformation process." Her amber eyes reflected something that might have been dark amusement. Problem was, they never figured out how to stop it. Marcus shifted his weight, bone spurs scraping against tree bark. The deterioration accelerated after abandonment. Stress response, probably. "We've been managing symptoms, but without proper monitoring." He didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood. Whatever time they had left as thinking beings was running out. The military had created super soldiers that were too unstable to deploy and too dangerous to contain. Now those soldiers were slowly losing their humanity, while struggling to survive in bodies that grew more monstrous by the day. "The facility has security," Jessica added, her words slightly slurred around her dental modifications. "Motion sensors, automated systems. We've tried to approach it twice. Both times triggered lockdown protocols that brought federal response teams within hours." Maggie's mind raced through possibilities. A veterinarian wouldn't have security clearance to access military installations, but she understood animals in ways that might prove relevant. The creatures before her weren't just transformed humans, they were apex predators whose instincts were increasingly divorced from human reasoning. Traditional approaches wouldn't work, but unconventional ones might. "The drought," she said slowly. "Water sources around the facility." David's massive head tilted in a gesture that was purely human. "Explain." "Security systems require power, cooling, maintenance. Automated facilities in remote locations typically use geothermal or hydroelectric power sources." She paused, pieces falling into place. "If the drought has affected their backup systems, if their primary power grid is stressed." "Electrical failures," Sarah finished, her voice carrying the first hint of genuine excitement Maggie had heard from any of them. "System vulnerabilities during peak demand periods." The plan forming in Maggie's mind was desperate and probably suicidal, but it offered something none of them had possessed before: hope, not just for accessing medical equipment, but for understanding what was happening to them. The research data from the facility might contain information about slowing or even reversing the transformation process. More importantly, it might contain evidence of who had authorized the program and where other test subjects might be located. "I'll need 3 days to prepare," she said, the words emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak them. "Equipment, supplies, transportation. And we'll need to coordinate the approach carefully. If we trigger security protocols, we all disappear into black sites," Marcus said grimly, "assuming they don't just eliminate loose ends permanently." The morning sun had risen higher, its light filtering through the canopy to illuminate the clearing where impossible creatures planned an assault on the facility that had created them. Maggie looked at each transformed face, seeing David's desperate hope reflected in alien eyes. She was committed now, past the point of rational retreat. Whatever happened next would either free them all or destroy everything she'd ever believed about justice, loyalty, and the price of truth. The 3 days of preparation passed in a blur of fevered planning and cold terror. Maggie had returned to the ranch with David's promise that they would meet at the facility perimeter on Friday night, when weekend staffing would be minimal and power grid strain at its peak. Now, crouched behind a stand of dead pine trees, with her veterinary supply bag and a pair of bolt cutters, she wondered if she'd lost her mind completely. The Helix research facility sprawled across a valley that had once housed a thriving copper mine. From her vantage point, Maggie could see the deceptive modesty of the surface structures, a few administrative buildings, maintenance sheds, and what appeared to be a defunct mining operation. But David had shown her thermal satellite images on her laptop, revealing the massive underground complex that extended hundreds of feet into the mountain itself. "Power substation is 200 meters north." David's voice emerged from the darkness beside her, though she still couldn't see him clearly despite 3 days of mental preparation. "Backup generators are diesel, but primary grid connection runs through transformers that should be stressed from the heat wave." Maggie nodded, checking her watch. 11:40 to 7 p.m. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. While the others created diversions to draw security attention, she would penetrate the administrative building through service tunnels and access the main computer systems. Her veterinary credentials might fool automated security long enough to download research files before the facility went into lockdown. What terrified her wasn't the possibility of capture. It was the certainty that once she crossed that fence, her old life would be gone forever. No more quiet evenings on the ranch. No more simple concerns about cattle prices and mortgage payments. She would be part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, complicit in a plan that could expose experimental programs that had destroyed dozens of lives. "You can still leave," David said, reading her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "Drive home, pretend you never found me." The offer was tempting beyond measure. 3 days ago, her biggest worry had been making the ranch profitable enough to avoid foreclosure. Now she was about to commit multiple federal crimes to help creatures that might not retain enough humanity to remember her sacrifice. The rational choice was obvious. But rationality had abandoned her the moment David emerged from that cave, carrying 3 years of grief and guilt that had nearly destroyed her. He had volunteered for an experimental program because he'd been too proud to burden her with his terminal diagnosis. The least she could do was help him find justice for what they'd done to him. Movement. Marcus's voice crackled through the radio clipped to her belt. 2 guards, southeast perimeter, switching to thermal scopes. Maggie's hands trembled as she adjusted her equipment. The plan required precise timing. Sarah and Jessica would trigger motion sensors on the far side of the complex, drawing security response while Thomas created electromagnetic interference by damaging the main power distribution lines. In the confusion, David would guide her through service tunnels that connected the surface buildings to the underground laboratory complex. Everything depended on the facility's automated systems reacting predictably to multiple simultaneous threats. If the AI security protocols had been updated since the program's termination, if backup systems were more robust than David's intelligence suggested, they would all be dead or disappeared within hours. "Maggie." David's clawed hand settled gently on her shoulder, the gesture incongruously tender despite his monstrous appearance. "The other subjects, the ones who disappeared after shutdown. We think they're still alive, still imprisoned. If we can access the research databases..." He didn't need to finish. The stakes were higher than just helping the 7 survivors in the forest. Somewhere in government black sites, other human beings were trapped in forms that grew more monstrous each day, abandoned by the people who'd promised to heal them. This wasn't just about medical treatment anymore. It was about bearing witness to atrocities that would otherwise remain forever hidden. "Thermal bloom, northwest quadrant," Jessica's voice reported. "They're responding to the bait." Maggie watched distant lights moving through the darkness as security teams mobilized toward false targets. In the administrative building, automated systems would be processing threat assessments, determining appropriate responses, allocating resources to neutralize perceived intrusions. For perhaps 15 minutes, human oversight would be minimal. "Now," David said. They moved toward the fence line. 2 impossible figures silhouetted against the dying light of a summer that had brought nothing but death and revelation. Maggie's bolt cutters made quick work of the chain link, opening a gap just wide enough for her to squeeze through. David's massive frame would follow a different route, one that avoided electronic sensors but required navigating terrain that would challenge even his enhanced abilities. As her feet touched the ground inside the facility perimeter, Maggie felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The woman who had cut through this fence was different from the one who would emerge, transformed not by experimental serums but by knowledge that would remake her understanding of loyalty, justice, and the price of truth. The ordeal had begun. The administrative building's service entrance yielded to Maggie's veterinary keycard, a stroke of luck she hadn't dared count on. David had vanished into the underground access tunnels, his massive frame somehow navigating spaces that seemed impossible for anything larger than maintenance equipment. The silence inside the building was absolute, broken only by the hum of climate control systems struggling against the August heat. Maggie's flashlight beam swept across sterile corridors, lined with motivational posters that seemed obscene in context. Excellence through innovation, serving those who serve. Each slogan was a mockery of what this place had actually produced. Broken minds trapped in predatory bodies, abandoned when their transformations exceeded all parameters. The computer terminal in the main administrative office accepted her credentials without question, confirming David's intelligence about minimal weekend security protocols. Her fingers trembled as she navigated through directory structures, searching for research files that might contain medical data about the transformation process. Every second brought her closer to answers that could save what remained of the test subject's humanity. Helixes Medical appeared in the file directory, followed by hundreds of subdirectories organized by subject number and date. Maggie inserted her flash drive, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen as gigabytes of data transferred. David's file was there, subject 23, terminal pancreatic cancer, initial transformation successful before cognitive deterioration began. Sarah, Jessica, Marcus, Thomas, all documented with clinical precision that reduced their agony to statistical variables. Then she found the others. 47 additional test subjects, their files marked transferred, black site containment. David had been right. The program hadn't ended with abandonment, it had moved underground, literally. Coordinates appeared in the files, locations of facilities in Nevada, Colorado, Virginia, places where human beings were still trapped in failing bodies while government doctors studied their deterioration. The flash drive was nearly full when the lights died. Emergency power kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing the corridor in red illumination that transformed everything into a scene from hell. Maggie's radio crackled with David's voice, distorted by static and underground interference. Lockdown initiated. They know you're inside. The computer terminal went dark as security protocols engaged, cutting her download at 87% completion. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, not the heavy boots of security guards, but the quick, purposeful stride of someone with authority, someone who had been waiting. Dr. Helena Voss stepped into the office doorway, her grey hair immaculate despite the late hour and emergency lighting. Maggie recognized her from photographs in the cave, the program's lead researcher, the woman whose signature appeared on every authorization form for experimental procedures that had destroyed dozens of lives. "Margaret Sinclair," Dr. Voss said, her voice carrying professional courtesy that made Maggie's skin crawl. "You're exactly what I expected from David's psychological profile. Intelligent, determined, catastrophically naive about the forces you're attempting to oppose." Maggie's hand closed around the flash drive, the data representing hope for every transformed test subject. "You abandoned them, left them to rot in the forest while you covered up your failures." "Failures?" Dr. Voss stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the red emergency lighting like something predatory. "Subject 23 can lift 2,000 pounds and survive injuries that would kill any normal human. The transformation exceeded our most optimistic projections. They're losing their minds, becoming animals. They're evolving beyond the limitations of human consciousness," Dr. Voss corrected. The cognitive changes were anticipated, even desired. Higher reasoning is incompatible with optimal combat effectiveness. The casual dismissal of human suffering was breathtaking in its cruelty. These weren't soldiers being enhanced, They were people being systematically stripped of everything that made them human, and Dr. Voss spoke of it like a feature, not a flaw. "Where are the others?" Maggie demanded. "The subjects you transferred to black sites." "Continuing to serve their country," Dr. Voss replied, "though I suspect they won't be serving much longer. The transformation process has certain temporal limitations." The implication hit Maggie like a physical blow. The missing test subjects were dying, their bodies finally succumbing to modifications that were never meant to be permanent. David and the others in the forest were living on borrowed time, their enhanced physiology slowly consuming itself. Security personnel flooded the corridor outside, their tactical lights cutting through the red emergency illumination. David's voice came through the radio one final time, distorted by static and distance. "Run, Maggie. Get out while you can." But there was nowhere to run. Dr. Voss smiled as armed figures filled the doorway, their weapons trained on a woman whose only crime had been seeking justice for the husband she'd thought she knew. "The good news," Dr. Voss said, "is that you won't be leaving empty-handed. We have a new phase of the program beginning soon, and we've been looking for subjects with veterinary expertise. Your understanding of animal physiology could prove invaluable." The flash drive fell from Maggie's nerveless fingers, 3 days of desperate planning crumbling into the certainty that she would never see the ranch again. The flash drive skittered across the polished floor, coming to rest against Dr. Voss's sensible black shoe. As the older woman bent to retrieve it, Maggie felt something crystallize in her mind, not panic, but a terrible, clarifying anger that burned away 3 years of self-doubt and misplaced grief. "You knew," she said, her voice steady despite the weapons trained on her. "When David volunteered for your program, you already knew it was a death sentence." Dr. Voss straightened, examining the drive with clinical interest. "Terminal pancreatic cancer was also a death sentence, Mrs. Sinclair. We offered him the opportunity to serve something greater than his own mortality. You offered him false hope while you planned to turn him into a weapon. Hope is always false until it becomes reality." Dr. Voss pocketed the drive. "Your husband's transformation was remarkably successful. The psychological profile we developed during his treatment indicated he would prioritize your emotional well-being above his own survival instincts. He specifically requested that you never be informed of his diagnosis." The words hit harder than any physical blow. David hadn't just hidden his illness. He'd volunteered for experimental treatment precisely because he'd known it would spare her the agony of watching him die slowly. The man she'd spent 3 years resenting for his absence had sacrificed his humanity to protect her from experiencing his suffering. Every bitter thought she'd harbored about his secretiveness, every moment she'd wondered if he'd stopped loving her enough to share his burdens, all of it crumbled under the weight of understanding his impossible choice. He'd chosen to become a monster rather than burden her with the knowledge of his terminal diagnosis. "The beautiful irony," Dr. Voss continued, "is that Subject 23 retained far more cognitive function than our models predicted. Most test subjects lost capacity for complex emotional attachment within weeks of transformation. David has maintained his protective instincts regarding you for over 3 years. Because he's still human," Maggie said fiercely. "Despite everything you did to him." "Because he's an evolutionary adaptation beyond human limitations," Dr. Voss corrected. "The capacity for selective loyalty while discarding inefficient emotional responses represents exactly the kind of enhancement we were seeking." But even as the words left the researcher's lips, Maggie saw the flaw in her reasoning. If David had truly discarded inefficient emotional responses, he would never have led her to the cave, never revealed the truth about his transformation, never risked exposure to help her understand what had happened to him. His love for her hadn't been eliminated by the experimental procedures. It had been refined into something powerful enough to override 3 years of programmed isolation. The realization shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the situation. Dr. Voss and her colleagues had created something they couldn't control precisely because they'd misunderstood what made their subjects human in the first place. They'd assumed that loyalty, compassion, and sacrifice were weaknesses to be eliminated rather than strengths to be preserved. "You're afraid of them," Maggie said, the truth emerging with startling clarity. "That's why you abandoned the program. Not because the transformations failed, but because they succeeded in ways you never intended." Dr. Voss's composed expression flickered for the first time. Enhanced subjects displayed concerning levels of independent decision-making. Tactical modifications were necessary to maintain operational control. They retained enough humanity to question orders, to recognize that what you were doing was monstrous. "They became security liabilities," Dr. Voss snapped, her professional mask slipping to reveal something ugly underneath. "Enhanced strength and resilience mean nothing if subjects refuse deployment based on ethical considerations that have no place in military operations." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The program hadn't been shut down because of scientific failures. It had been terminated because the transformed soldiers had retained enough conscience to rebel against their intended purpose. Dr. Voss and her team had tried to create perfect weapons and instead had created beings who combined apex predator capabilities with human moral reasoning. No wonder they'd been abandoned in the forest. No wonder the surviving subjects had been transferred to black sites. The military had invested billions in creating super soldiers who couldn't be deployed because they refused to abandon the very humanity that made them effective soldiers in the first place. "The new phase will correct those design flaws," Dr. Voss said, her composure returning. "We've identified the neurological pathways responsible for ethical inhibition. Future subjects will retain tactical intelligence while eliminating problematic moral reasoning." Maggie stared at the woman who spoke of destroying human conscience with the same clinical detachment she might use to discuss removing a tumor. This wasn't medical research. It was systematic dehumanization disguised as patriotic service. Dr. Voss and her colleagues weren't trying to heal wounded veterans. They were trying to create creatures who could kill without question or remorse. And they wanted to use her veterinary expertise to perfect the process of turning human beings into mindless predators. The tactical lights wavered slightly as something moved in the corridor behind the security team. David had found another way inside. The lights died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, chaos erupted with primal ferocity. Security personnel shouted commands that were lost in the thunderous sound of metal being torn apart. Emergency lighting flickered back online just in time to illuminate David's massive form as he moved through the corridor like a force of nature, his clawed hands systematically disabling armed men who had never encountered anything like him. Maggie pressed herself against the wall as gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing through the red emergency illumination. But David wasn't fighting. He was controlling the engagement with tactical precision that spoke to his retained military training. Each movement was calculated to neutralize threats while creating escape routes, his enhanced reflexes turning him into something between predator and guardian angel. "The data," he growled as he reached her, his amber eyes luminous in the crimson light. "Did you get it?" Dr. Voss had vanished in the confusion, taking the flash drive with her. But Maggie's mind was racing through alternatives, drawing on 30 years of veterinary experience that had taught her to adapt when plans went sideways. "The backup servers," she said. "Every facility maintains redundant systems. If we can reach the underground laboratory." David's expression shifted, surprise and something like pride flickering across his monstrous features. "That area is more heavily defended. Then we better move fast." They fled through corridors that had become a war zone, following service routes that David navigated with uncanny precision. Behind them, security teams regrouped while automated systems initiated lockdown protocols designed to contain exactly this kind of breach. But the facility's designers had never anticipated threats that combined human intelligence with capabilities that bordered on supernatural. The underground laboratory complex stretched beneath the administrative buildings like a technological catacomb. Banks of servers hummed in climate-controlled chambers, while research terminals displayed data streams that represented years of human experimentation. Maggie's veterinary background had prepared her for many things, but not for seeing her own species reduced to experimental parameters on computer screens. There, David pointed toward a master terminal that glowed like an altar in the sterile space. Full database access, but we'll have maybe 3 minutes before they override the security locks. Maggie's fingers flew across the keyboard, decades of medical training translating into intuitive navigation through research databases. The files were massive, not just transformation protocols, but genetic markers, psychological profiles, physiological monitoring data that tracked every aspect of the test subject's deterioration. She copied everything, letting automated systems sort priorities while she searched for the information that mattered most. Treatment protocols, reversal procedures, stabilization therapies that might slow or halt the cognitive degradation that was consuming David and the others. Maggie. His voice carried a note she'd never heard before, hope tempered by 3 years of abandonment. The others, the ones at the black sites. Are they alive? She confirmed, her heart breaking at the relief in his inhuman features. Contained, experimented on, but alive. And there are reversal procedures here, David. Incomplete, theoretical, but it's something. It's a start. The download progress bar crawled toward completion while alarms shrieked overhead. Security teams would breach the laboratory within minutes, but for the first time in days, Maggie felt something other than desperation driving her actions. She felt purpose crystallizing into unshakable resolve. Dr. Voss and her colleagues had created something beyond their ability to control or comprehend. They'd tried to strip away humanity, and instead had forged beings who combined the best aspects of human conscience with capabilities that transcended normal physical limitations. The failed super soldiers weren't weapons. They were evolution in action, proving that morality and strength could coexist in ways that military planners couldn't weaponize. Download complete, the system announced. Maggie pocketed the drive as David moved toward the laboratory's emergency exit, but she found herself hesitating, her gaze falling on research terminals that displayed ongoing experiments. Somewhere, in government black sites, 47 human beings were trapped in failing bodies, while doctors like Dr. Voss perfected techniques to eliminate conscience itself. "We can't just escape," she said, the words emerging with startling clarity. "This has to end here." David's amber eyes met hers, and she saw understanding pass between them. They had the data needed to potentially help the transformed subjects, but they also had something more powerful, proof of systematic human rights violations that could expose the entire program. The question was whether they possessed the courage to become witnesses rather than survivors. "The research databases," Maggie continued, her veterinary training providing tactical insight. "If we corrupt them completely, they'll lose years of data. The new phase Dr. Voss mentioned, we could set their research back decades." David nodded slowly, his monstrous appearance somehow conveying profound determination. "Then we burn it all down." They moved together toward the master servers, 2 unlikely allies preparing to commit acts of sabotage that would either save dozens of lives or ensure their own destruction. The master servers hummed with electronic life, their cooling fans whispering secrets that had cost too many lives to accumulate. Maggie's hands trembled as she accessed the administrative controls, her veterinary training never having prepared her for this kind of systematic destruction. But 30 years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure served her well as she navigated through security protocols that Dr. Voss probably assumed were impenetrable. "Physical destruction," David said, his clawed hands already moving toward the server housing. "Faster than digital corruption." "No." Maggie's voice carried surprising authority. "If we just smash everything, they'll claim equipment failure, blame terrorists, spin it as an attack on national security. We need to make it look like the program destroyed itself." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing experimental protocols that detailed 3 years of human suffering. She began reversing safety parameters, overriding cooling systems, instructing the servers to run computational processes that would generate catastrophic heat buildup. To anyone investigating afterward, it would appear that the research programs had become so complex and unstable that they'd literally burned themselves out. "Elegant," David murmured, and she heard echoes of her husband's admiration in his transformed voice. "You always were smarter than you gave yourself credit for." The compliment hit harder than expected, carrying weight from a man who'd sacrificed his humanity partly to spare her pain. But this wasn't the time for emotional reconciliation. Footsteps echoed in the corridor above as security teams converged on their location. "The backup drives," Maggie said, spotting a secondary storage system. "Everything gets automatically copied to off-site facilities. We need to corrupt those transfers too." She accessed the backup protocols, while David moved to the laboratory's chemical storage, his enhanced senses apparently detecting something useful. The transformed subjects hadn't just retained their human intelligence, they'd gained capabilities that allowed them to perceive and interact with their environment in ways that normal humans couldn't match. "Thermite charges," he said, returning with materials that Maggie wouldn't have known how to identify. "Military demolitions training. Some things don't change even after transformation." But everything else had changed. As they worked together to plant charges that would ensure complete data destruction, Maggie found herself observing her husband with a mixture of grief and wonder. The man she'd married still existed within this monstrous form, but he'd been refined by suffering into something both more and less than human. "The other subjects," she said as David positioned charges with professional precision. "When this facility is exposed, when people understand what was done here, they'll hunt us," David finished. "Government agencies, military contractors, everyone who profited from the program will want us eliminated before we can testify." The brutal honesty was typical of the man she'd known, but it carried new weight coming from someone who'd spent 3 years living as a fugitive. Dr. Voss and her colleagues hadn't just transformed human beings into weapons, they created living evidence of war crimes that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. Maggie activated the final corruption protocol as emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in hellish red illumination. Somewhere above, security teams were probably coordinating with Dr. Voss to contain a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. But they were fighting yesterday's war, trying to capture people who'd moved beyond normal human limitations. 20 seconds until thermal cascade, David warned, his enhanced hearing apparently tracking the server system's deterioration. "Exit routes are compromised, but there's a maintenance tunnel that leads to the original cave system." Of course, the facility had been built over the natural caves where David and the others had sheltered, military planners probably considering it poetic justice to construct their monument to human experimentation directly above the victims they'd abandoned. But those same caves now offered escape routes that no architectural blueprint could anticipate. They moved through service corridors as the first servers began overheating, their cooling systems overwhelmed by processes that were consuming computational resources at unsustainable rates. Behind them, years of research dissolved into superheated metal and corrupted data streams. The new phase Dr. Voss had planned, enhanced soldiers stripped of conscience and moral reasoning, would have to begin again from scratch. The maintenance tunnel was cramped and stifling, but it led steadily downward toward natural limestone formations that had sheltered transformed subjects for 3 years. Maggie crawled through darkness that felt less like escape than transition, moving from a world where she'd been a victim toward whatever came next. "This isn't over," she said as they reached the cave entrance. "Even with the data destroyed, they'll rebuild, find new test subjects, perfect their techniques for eliminating human conscience." David's amber eyes reflected starlight as they emerged into the Arkansas night. "Then we make sure the world knows what they're really doing." Above them, the research facility burned with fires that would consume evidence of systematic atrocities. But Maggie carried something more valuable than data in her pocket. She carried testimony that could expose a conspiracy built on the premise that human beings were raw material for military enhancement. The final confrontation wouldn't happen in underground laboratories or government facilities. It would happen in courtrooms and congressional hearings, where truth mattered more than enhanced strength or experimental protocols. The facility's emergency sirens wailed across the Arkansas wilderness as Maggie and David emerged from the cave system, But the sound that made her blood freeze wasn't mechanical. It was the rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. Multiple aircraft approaching fast from the north where Fort Campbell housed rapid response teams trained for exactly this kind of containment operation. "They're not coming to arrest us," David said, his enhanced hearing apparently picking up radio chatter that Maggie couldn't detect. "Elimination protocols. Dr. Voss convinced someone that we're too dangerous to capture alive." Maggie's hand closed around the flash drive in her pocket. Years of veterinary training, suddenly inadequate preparation for becoming a target of military assassination. But as she watched her transformed husband scanning the sky with predatory focus, she realized that everything she'd learned over the past week had been building toward this moment, not just about David's transformation or the government conspiracy, but about her own capacity to choose justice over safety. "The data we retrieved," she said, her voice steadying despite the approaching aircraft. "It's not just evidence of what they did to you and the others. There are financial records, congressional appropriations, authorization codes that trace back to Pentagon officials. This goes all the way to the top," David nodded grimly. "Which means they'll commit any atrocity necessary to keep it buried." The first helicopter crested the tree line, its searchlights sweeping across the burning facility before pivoting toward their position. Maggie counted 3 aircraft in total, enough firepower to level half the county if necessary. These weren't investigators or medical personnel. They were cleanup crews preparing to eliminate witnesses to decades of human experimentation. "The cave system," David said, already moving. "It connects to natural caverns that extend for miles underground. If we can reach the deepest chambers." "No." The word emerged with surprising force, startling them both. "I'm done running." Maggie turned to face the approaching helicopters, her 68-year-old frame dwarfed by military aircraft that represented everything she'd discovered about institutional power, corrupted beyond recognition. But she'd spent 3 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and something in her veterinary experience had prepared her for this moment of absolute moral clarity. "My satellite phone," she continued, pulling the device from her pack. "Dr. Sarah Chen at the CDC, Senator Martinez from the Armed Services Committee, investigative reporters I've worked with on agricultural contamination cases. If I can transmit the data files before they kill us—" "They'll jam communications," David interrupted. "Standard protocol for elimination operations. We make them choose." Maggie's fingers flew across the phone's interface, uploading files to every contact in her directory. "They can maintain operational security by committing mass murder in front of multiple witnesses, or they can let us surrender publicly and face the consequences of congressional investigation." The helicopters were close enough now that she could see helmeted figures preparing repelling equipment. Dr. Voss had apparently convinced her superiors that David and Maggie represented existential threats to national security, enemy agents rather than American citizens who'd uncovered war crimes committed by their own government. But as Maggie initiated the data transmission, she realized that her week of discovering terrible truths had taught her something crucial about institutional power. It was only as strong as people's willingness to believe official narratives. The moment ordinary citizens understood what had been done in their name, the conspiracy would collapse under the weight of public outrage. "Upload progress 50%, the phone announced. The lead helicopter descended toward a clearing 200 yards away, its rotor wash flattening grass that was still brown from the August heat wave that had started everything. Maggie thought about the massive canine tracks she'd discovered around her property just 7 days ago. Footprints that had led her into a nightmare that revealed the man she'd loved wasn't who she'd thought he was, but that the truth was more complex and heartbreaking than simple betrayal. "They're deploying," David warned, his enhanced vision tracking movement in the aircraft. "Military contractors, not regular soldiers. Private security that won't be bound by rules of engagement." Maggie continued the upload as armed figures emerged from the helicopters, their tactical gear and coordinated movements speaking to professional competence that had probably been honed in overseas operations. These weren't investigators or even military police. They were assassins preparing to eliminate American citizens on American soil to protect a government program that had systematically violated every principle the Constitution was designed to preserve. 75% complete. The tactical teams spread out in standard search patterns, but something in their body language suggested confusion. They'd been briefed to eliminate dangerous fugitives, but their targets were a veterinarian in her 60s and what appeared to be a large dog. The cognitive dissonance between mission parameters and observed reality was creating hesitation that might be their only advantage. "Upload complete," the phone announced. Maggie smiled as she raised her hands in surrender. 47 gigabytes of evidence now distributed to dozens of recipients who would ensure the truth survived even if she didn't. The tactical team leader's voice cut through the night air with mechanical precision. "Margaret Sinclair, you are in violation of the Espionage Act and the National Defense Authorization Act. Surrender the stolen classified materials immediately." Maggie kept her hands raised, but her voice carried the authority of 3 decades treating wounded animals who couldn't understand why she had to hurt them to help them. "The materials have already been transmitted to Senator Martinez's office, the CDC, and 12 investigative journalists. You're about 30 minutes too late for containment." She watched the team leader's body language shift as he processed this information. His tactical training probably never having covered scenarios where elderly veterinarians successfully outmaneuvered military intelligence operations. Behind him, other operators maintained firing positions while speaking into throat microphones, undoubtedly requesting guidance from commanders who were realizing that their elimination protocols had just become exponentially more complicated. "Dr. Voss assured us you were enemy agents," the team leader said, uncertainty creeping into his professional demeanor. "Foreign operatives attempting to steal weapons research." "Dr. Eleanor Voss lied to you," David said, stepping into the helicopter's searchlight. His transformation was complete now, 8 feet of muscle and fur that should have triggered immediate hostile response. Instead, the tactical team hesitated, their weapons tracking but not firing. "We're American citizens who discovered that our government has been conducting illegal human experimentation on captured soldiers." Maggie saw confusion ripple through the assembled operators. They'd been told they were protecting national security by eliminating terrorist threats, but their targets were speaking with calm reasonableness about congressional oversight and constitutional violations. The cognitive dissonance was creating exactly the kind of operational hesitation she'd hoped for. "The flash drive contains 3 years of documentation," she continued, her veterinary training translating into steady composure under life-threatening pressure. "Genetic manipulation protocols, psychological torture techniques, evidence that 47 American servicemen were deliberately transformed into test subjects without their consent." Dr. Voss didn't mention that part in her briefing, did she? The team leader's weapon lowered slightly as he absorbed information that contradicted everything he'd been told about the mission. Professional soldiers were trained to follow orders without question, but they were also trained to recognize when operational parameters had fundamentally changed. The woman standing before him wasn't a foreign agent. She was someone's grandmother who'd stumbled into a conspiracy that powerful people would kill to protect. "Stand down," came a voice from his radio. "Repeat, all units, stand down. Do not engage targets. Await further instructions." Maggie felt relief flood through her as weapons were lowered, but David remained tense beside her. His enhanced senses were apparently detecting something that normal human perception missed. Perhaps additional threats or the approach of different forces with less restrictive rules of engagement. "Dr. Voss," he said quietly. The scientist emerged from the second helicopter with the controlled fury of someone watching years of carefully constructed work collapse in real time. She wore civilian clothes now rather than her laboratory coat, but her expression carried the same cold calculation that had justified decades of human experimentation. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," Dr. Voss said, her voice carrying across the clearing. The enhanced soldier program represented humanity's next evolutionary step. Strength without the weakness of excessive moral reasoning. Capabilities that could have protected American interests for generations. You mean capabilities that could have eliminated American conscience permanently? Maggie replied, stepping forward despite David's warning growl. I read your research notes, Doctor. Phase 3 wasn't about creating better soldiers. It was about creating perfect killers who couldn't question orders. Dr. Voss's laugh was bitter. Morality is a luxury we can't afford in modern warfare. Enemy forces don't hesitate because they're concerned about civilian casualties or constitutional principles. Why should we handicap our defenders with outdated ethical constraints? Because those constraints are what we're supposed to be defending, David said, his transformed voice carrying echoes of the man who'd once believed in serving something greater than himself. You didn't create enhanced soldiers, Doctor. You created monsters. And the greatest monster isn't standing here in the searchlight. It's the one wearing a lab coat who thinks human conscience is a design flaw to be eliminated. The confrontation crystallized everything Maggie had learned about institutional power and personal responsibility. Dr. Voss represented a system that viewed human beings as raw material for enhancement, while David embodied the possibility that strength and morality could coexist, even under the most extreme circumstances. The program will continue, Dr. Voss said, her composure cracking as she realized that decades of classified research were now subject to congressional investigation. Other facilities, different authorization codes, enhanced security protocols. You've delayed us, not stopped us. Maybe, Maggie said, thinking about 47 gigabytes of evidence now spreading through networks that Dr. Voss couldn't control or contain. But we've also shown the world what you really are. The tactical team leader's radio crackled with new orders, his expression shifting from confusion to grim professionalism. Override authorization confirmed. Targets are to be neutralized regardless of data transmission status. National Security Priority Alpha. Maggie felt the night air change as weapons were raised again, but this time there was no hesitation in the operator's movements. Someone with authority beyond Dr. Voss had decided that 2 witnesses to decades of human experimentation were too dangerous to leave alive, even if it meant committing murder in front of military personnel who'd sworn oaths to protect American citizens. They're going to kill us anyway, David said, his enhanced hearing picking up tactical communications. Data release doesn't matter now. They'll claim we were foreign agents, fabricate evidence, classify everything under national security exemptions. Maggie understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to die to protect a conspiracy that had transformed her husband into something barely human, then used him as a test subject for 3 years of systematic torture. The truth would survive in the files she'd transmitted, but the cost of exposing it would be everything she had left. But as she watched David tense beside her, amber eyes reflecting searchlight beams, she realized that victory sometimes required sacrifices that couldn't be calculated in advance. The other subjects, she said quietly, her voice carrying only to David's enhanced hearing. Marcus, Tommy, Richardson. They're still in those caves. If these people kill us, who protects them? David's massive form shuddered with understanding. 44 transformed soldiers were sheltering in limestone caverns beneath their feet, men who'd retained enough humanity to recognize that they were the living evidence of war crimes committed by their own government. They couldn't speak for themselves in congressional hearings or testify before cameras, but they deserved someone willing to stand between them and the people who'd created them. I won't let them be hunted, David said. Maggie nodded, feeling 3 decades of veterinary practice crystallize into a moment of absolute moral clarity. She'd spent her career making decisions about when suffering became unbearable, when prolonging life meant prolonging agony. Some situations demanded choices that couldn't be undone. The satellite phone, she whispered, slipping the device toward David. Dr. Chen's direct line is programmed as speed dial 3. Tell her about the caves, about the others who need protection. Maggie. Someone has to speak for them. She stepped forward into the searchlight, her 68-year-old frame dwarfed by military aircraft but carrying the moral weight of every decision she'd made over the past week. Someone has to make sure the world understands what was done to American soldiers in the name of national security. The tactical team leader's finger moved toward his trigger as Dr. Voss watched with clinical detachment. 3 years of careful planning, decades of classified research, careers built on the premise that human conscience could be eliminated through genetic manipulation. All of it threatened by a retired veterinarian who'd stumbled across tracks in drought-hardened soil. "Dr. Voss," Maggie called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. "When you write your reports about tonight, remember that the greatest threat to your program wasn't enhanced soldiers or foreign agents. It was the possibility that ordinary people might discover what you really are." The gunfire erupted before she finished speaking, but David was already moving with speed that human reflexes couldn't track. His transformed body absorbed impacts that would have killed normal flesh, giving him time to reach the tree line where shadows provided cover that tactical lights couldn't penetrate. Maggie fell to her knees in grass that was still brown from the August heatwave, feeling warmth spread across her chest as helicopters pivoted to pursue David into wilderness that had sheltered transformed soldiers for 3 years. She thought about the massive canine tracks she'd discovered around her property, footprints that had led her into a nightmare that revealed truth was more important than the comfortable lies she'd lived with for decades. The satellite phone glowed beside her as David's voice carried across emergency frequencies, speaking to Dr. Chen about caves that held living evidence of systematic atrocities. 44 subjects who'd retained enough humanity to recognize that they deserved protection from the people who'd created them. Behind her, the research facility continued burning with fires that would consume decades of classified documentation. But the real victory wasn't in destroyed data or exposed conspiracies. It was in the knowledge that someone would speak for the victims, that their suffering wouldn't be hidden or forgotten. Dr. Voss approached with the controlled fury of someone watching life's work collapse, but Maggie smiled as consciousness faded. The cost of winning had been everything she had left to give. But David was free. The truth was spreading through networks that couldn't be contained, and 44 transformed soldiers would have someone willing to stand between them and the people who thought human conscience was a design flaw to be eliminated. The satellite phone's glow dimmed as Maggie's vision narrowed, but David's voice continued transmitting across emergency frequencies, even as helicopter searchlights swept through the tree line pursuing him. She could hear Dr. Chen's shocked responses echoing through the device, a CDC official learning in real time that the United States military had been conducting genetic experiments that made Nazi medical research look primitive by comparison. 44 American servicemen, David was saying, his transformed vocal cords carrying across radio waves that Dr. Voss couldn't jam without creating an international incident. Sergeant Marcus Williams, Private Tommy Richardson, Corporal David Hayes, all reported as killed in action, all held in limestone caves for 3 years of systematic torture disguised as enhancement protocols. Dr. Voss knelt beside Maggie, her clinical demeanor finally cracking as she realized that decades of carefully compartmentalized research were now being broadcast to emergency responders across 3 states. "You have no comprehension of what you've destroyed," she whispered, her voice carrying the fury of someone watching life's work disintegrate. The applications were limitless. Disease resistance, enhanced healing, cognitive improvements that could have eliminated human suffering permanently. Maggie's breathing was shallow, but her veterinary training helped her recognize that the bullet had missed vital organs. She was dying, but slowly enough to witness the aftermath of everything she'd set in motion. "You eliminated human choice," she managed, blood speckling her lips. "That's not enhancement, that's extermination of everything that makes us worth saving." The helicopter's rotor wash flattened grass that was still recovering from August's brutal heat wave, but the pilots were struggling to track David through wilderness he'd learned to navigate during 3 years of hiding from the people who'd created him. His transformed senses gave him advantages that military technology couldn't overcome. He knew every cave entrance, every limestone passage, every hidden shelter that could protect 44 soldiers who'd become living evidence of institutional atrocity. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the satellite phone's speaker, her medical authority cutting through tactical communications. "Dr. Voss, I'm issuing immediate CDC emergency protocols for the protection of human research subjects. Any attempt to interfere with medical evacuation of those caves will be treated as a violation of international humanitarian law. The CDC has no jurisdiction over classified military operations, Dr. Voss replied, but her tone carried the defensiveness of someone realizing that bureaucratic shields were dissolving. Congressional oversight, international medical organizations, media attention, the conspiracy that had thrived in darkness was being dragged into spotlight it couldn't survive. Maggie closed her eyes, listening to David's voice grow more distant as he led military pursuit deeper into Ozark wilderness that had sheltered transformed soldiers who'd retained enough humanity to recognize they deserved protection from their creators. She thought about the massive canine tracks she'd discovered around her property 8 days ago, footprints that had seemed like simple curiosities before revealing themselves as evidence of systematic human experimentation conducted by her own government. Her husband's involvement still carried the sting of betrayal, but she understood now that Robert had been as much a victim as the subjects he'd helped transform. A veterinarian recruited for expertise in animal behavior modification, then gradually corrupted by institutional pressure that made atrocity seem like patriotic duty. The man she'd loved had disappeared piece by piece, replaced by someone who could justify torture as enhancement and elimination of conscience as evolutionary progress. "The tactical teams are withdrawing," came a voice from the helicopter's radio communications. "Orders from Washington. Minimal engagement protocols, avoid civilian casualties, maintain operational security." Dr. Voss's expression shifted from fury to calculation as she processed this development. Someone with authority beyond field operations had recognized that the situation had evolved beyond their ability to contain through violence. Too many people knew too much, and the political cost of continued cover-up was beginning to exceed the value of protecting classified research. "Congressional hearings," Maggie whispered, understanding with veterinary precision how institutional organisms responded to existential threats. "Media investigations, international oversight. You can't kill your way out of this anymore." The scientist stood slowly, her laboratory coat replaced by civilian clothes that couldn't disguise the clinical coldness that had justified decades of human experimentation. "Enhanced soldiers will be developed eventually," she said, speaking more to herself than to the dying woman at her feet. "Other facilities, different authorization codes, improved security protocols. This represents delay, not defeat." But Maggie smiled as consciousness began to fade, because David's voice was still carrying across emergency frequencies, still speaking to officials who couldn't unknow what they'd learned about caves holding American servicemen transformed against their will. The truth had momentum now that institutional power couldn't reverse. It would spread through networks that Dr. Voss couldn't control, creating accountability that classified programs couldn't escape. Behind her, the research facility continued burning with fires that would consume decades of documentation. But the real victory wasn't in destroyed data. It was in the knowledge that 44 men who'd been systematically dehumanized would have someone willing to speak for them, to ensure their suffering wasn't forgotten or hidden. The cost had been everything she had left to give, but some truths were worth dying to protect. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room couldn't quite mask the scent of autumn leaves drifting through the partially open window. Maggie's eyes opened to afternoon sunlight filtering through Venetian blinds, her chest wrapped in bandages that pulled tight with each breath. The bullet had missed her heart by inches, close enough that the doctors had called her survival miraculous, though she suspected David's quick action in applying pressure to the wound had more to do with it than divine intervention. "You're awake." Dr. Chen sat in the visitor's chair, her CDC credentials clipped to a blazer that looked like it hadn't been changed in days. "How are you feeling?" Maggie tested her voice, finding it rougher than expected. "Like I've been shot by my own government." She tried to sit up, wincing at the movement. "David? Safe. Hidden. The Congressional Committee has granted him protected witness status, but he's chosen to remain in the caves with the others until proper medical facilities can be established." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the past week learning that human experimentation hadn't ended with Nuremberg. 44 men, Maggie. All reported Kia, all transformed against their will, the largest violation of human research ethics in modern history. Through the window, Maggie could see news vans parked outside the hospital, their satellite dishes pointed towards sky that seemed impossibly blue after the nightmare of the past week. The story had broken 3 days ago. Military conducts genetic experiments on US soldiers, and the political fallout was still spreading through Washington like wildfire. "My property?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Dr. Chen's expression. "Secured as a federal crime scene. The cave system is being treated as a humanitarian site now, rather than a research facility. International medical teams, constitutional lawyers, victim advocates, people who understand that those men deserve protection, not continued experimentation." Maggie closed her eyes, thinking about the 40 acres that had been her refuge for 3 years after Robert's death. The land would never feel the same now that she knew limestone caverns beneath her feet had sheltered transformed soldiers who'd retained enough humanity to seek justice for what had been done to them. But perhaps that was appropriate. Some truths changed everything they touched, making comfortable ignorance impossible to maintain. Dr. Voss? Arrested, along with 17 other researchers, 12 military officials, and 3 private contractors. The program had been operating for 15 years, funded through black budget allocations that nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. Dr. Chen's voice carried professional satisfaction tempered by horror at what the investigation had revealed. Your husband's files were the key. His veterinary research notes documented every stage of the transformation process, every ethical boundary that was crossed. The betrayal still stung, but Maggie found it easier to process now. Robert hadn't started as a monster. He'd been recruited for expertise in animal behavior modification, then gradually corrupted by institutional pressure that made atrocity seem like patriotic duty. A good man destroyed piece by piece until he could justify transforming human beings into weapons while telling himself he was serving his country. "The others want to meet you," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Marcus, Tommy, Richardson, they understand that you're the reason anyone knows they exist, that they're not just classified footnotes anymore." Maggie nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready for that conversation. "How did you speak to men who'd been systematically dehumanized, who'd spent 3 years hiding in darkness because their own government had transformed them into something that couldn't return to normal life? What comfort could a 68-year-old veterinarian offer to victims of atrocities that most people would refuse to believe?" But David had trusted her enough to reveal himself, to lead her to truth that powerful people had killed to protect. The least she could do was honor that trust by ensuring the other subjects weren't forgotten or abandoned. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Your nephew called Michael? He's been trying to reach you since the story broke." Maggie felt tears threaten for the first time since waking up. Michael, Robert's sister's boy, who'd been the closest thing to family she'd had since her husband's death. She'd been dreading the moment when people who'd known Robert would learn what he'd become, how the man they'd respected had participated in systematic human experimentation. But perhaps that conversation was part of returning to the world, accepting that truth was more important than protecting comfortable memories, that the people who loved her deserved honesty about what she'd discovered in the caves beneath her property. Outside, the news vans continued their vigil, but Maggie felt something like peace settling over her. She'd lost everything: her home, her husband's memory, her faith in institutions she'd trusted her entire life, but she'd also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that ordinary people could still choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience. The world she was returning to was different now, and so was she. The phone call with Michael lasted 2 hours, stretching into evening as autumn shadows lengthened across the hospital room floor. Her nephew's voice had carried shock, grief, and something else, a quiet pride that surprised her. "Aunt Maggie," he'd said finally, "Uncle Robert would have wanted you to do what you did, the man we knew, before whatever happened to him in those final years." Maybe that was true. Maybe the husband she'd loved was still there somewhere beneath the scientist who'd participated in systematic torture, and maybe he would have approved of her choice to expose everything he'd helped create. The thought brought unexpected comfort as she prepared to leave the sterile safety of the hospital for a world that had fundamentally changed. Dr. Chen drove her to the temporary housing facility 3 towns over, a converted motel that the CDC had requisitioned for what they were calling transition support. The media attention had made returning to her property impossible, even if she'd wanted to live above caves that had sheltered 44 transformed men for 3 years. "It's not permanent," Dr. Chen assured her as they pulled into the parking lot. "The Victim Compensation Fund will provide better housing once the congressional appropriations are finalized. This is just until things settle down." Maggie nodded, watching other residents move between modest rooms with the careful deliberation of people learning to exist in spaces that couldn't contain the magnitude of what they'd experienced. Wives of soldiers reported dead who were actually being held in underground facilities. Children who'd grown up without fathers because the military had decided their dads were more valuable as test subjects than as human beings. A community of survivors bound together by institutional betrayal. Her room was small but clean, with a window that faced west toward the Ozark Mountains. Somewhere in that wilderness, David and the others were working with medical teams to establish what Dr. Chen called rehabilitation protocols. Though how you rehabilitated someone who'd been genetically transformed against their will remained an open question. The dresser held a few changes of clothes that Michael had brought from her property before it was sealed as a crime scene. Beneath them, wrapped in one of Robert's old flannel shirts, were the photographs she'd asked Dr. Chen to retrieve from her kitchen table. Images of her husband from their early years together, before whatever darkness had consumed him in those final months. She set one on the nightstand, Robert at 35, laughing as he helped deliver a difficult calf on a neighbor's farm. His hands gentle despite their strength, his eyes bright with the compassion that had made her fall in love with a country veterinarian who treated every animal like it mattered. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a man in his 40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that couldn't quite hide the unnatural breadth of his shoulders. His eyes were human, but they held depths that spoke of transformation no amount of medical intervention could completely reverse. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus Williams, Staff Sergeant formerly of the 3rd Infantry Division." His voice carried careful control, like someone who'd learned to modulate strength that could accidentally cause harm. "I wanted to thank you." Maggie stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he moved with predatory grace despite obvious efforts to appear unthreatening. "You don't need to thank me. What was done to you, to all of you, it was wrong. Someone had to speak. But you didn't have to." Marcus sat carefully in the room's single chair, his transformation evident in the way furniture creaked under weight that normal human bone and muscle couldn't support. "You could have kept quiet, protected your husband's memory, lived comfortably with what you didn't know. Instead, you chose us." They talked for an hour about small things, the weather, the food at the facility, the strange experience of learning to exist in a world that knew their story but couldn't fully comprehend what they'd endured. Marcus had been 22 when he volunteered for what he was told was experimental combat training. That was 8 years ago. He'd spent more time as something other than human than as the young soldier who'd wanted to serve his country. "The hardest part isn't the physical changes," he said eventually. "It's remembering that we chose to serve, and this is what service got us. That the people we trusted to lead us decided we were more valuable as weapons than as human beings." After he left, Maggie sat by the window watching stars emerge over mountains that held caves she'd never see again. Tomorrow, she would meet with congressional investigators who needed her testimony about Robert's files and the discovery that had exposed everything. Next week, she would speak with international human rights organizations about the implications of genetic experimentation conducted without consent or oversight. The woman who'd spent 3 quiet years grieving her husband's death was gone, replaced by someone who understood that ordinary people sometimes face choices that defined not just their own lives, but the moral trajectory of the world around them. She'd lost everything she'd thought she wanted: her home, her peaceful retirement, her faith in comfortable lies. But watching those stars wheel overhead, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since finding massive canine tracks around her property 2 months ago: hope. Not for herself, but for the 44 men who would finally receive the care and recognition they deserved, and for a country that might yet prove capable of confronting its own capacity for institutional atrocity. The new beginning wasn't what she'd expected, but it was honest. And after decades of veterinary practice, she knew that healing always began with truth, no matter how much it hurt to acknowledge.